Well, we are in Lamentations chapter 1, as you will remember, a most unique passage or book in the Bible, and that it is a poem written to be poetry, not just line by line sort of teaching or something. It's a eulogy for a nation and the city of Jerusalem that's been carried away into captivity in Babylon, or dispersed to Egypt or other places around the planet at the time, as folks were driven out of the nation and out of the city. You'll remember the city. I told Kathy if I just had a few more minutes this morning, I'd have put together an animation of Jerusalem falling for you, but I just didn't have the time, and the computer skills and a few other minor little details, but it would be neat to somehow have some way to visualize that city and try to imagine what it must have looked like to those who have been there. We'll get little glimpses in the words this morning, and I'm hoping maybe you can catch some of the word pictures, if you will, that are presented to us. But just a devastated pile of rubble with bits and pieces of remaining walls, burned out buildings everywhere. The palaces, the cedar that we saw described in Solomon's palace and things like that as we go back when he was in the height of his glory, and all that is gone. The gold, the silver, the bronze, all the valuable metals have been confiscated by the scrap iron dealers from Babylon, and they have packed it off with them, melted it down. It's all been removed, so there's nothing much left of value, just broken walls, probably a few carcasses of dead dogs, maybe a few scrawny dogs wandering through town, living off of the dead and dying. And probably, as this is being remembered and written down, they probably still remember the bodies of the fallen, both from the attack and from starvation, and probably littered the city. So that brings us to Lamentations, and again, you remember it's an acrostic. It's written with alphabetical, so as you go through it, each one of these verses begins with the letter of the Hebrew alphabet, and so it's leading us through, and each one of these has three thoughts that are related in each verse. So as you listen and we go through this, hopefully you can pick that out, that it was designed there to add emphasis to what they were wanting to say. I thought as we began this morning, I would read through verses 1 through 11, or the first segment that kind of hang together, if you will. And remember, this is WJER TV News, going out and looking over the city, kind of removed. It's all third person, talking about the city, about the situation from the third person, as they, with some emotion and feeling for it, and yet somewhat removed from the direct impact of it, relate to the looks of the city. So I've printed out for you, just to give you a little different version each time. Last time we read New American Standard, and this time I'm going to read the English Standard Version. It's the one that Pastor Adam preaches from on Sunday morning, so you hear just a slightly different way of wording it. And then we'll start going through our verse by verse again. So verses 1 through 11, if I can get through it here, we'll just read through. How lonely sits the city that was full of people. How like a widow has she become, she who was great among the nations. She who was a princess among the provinces has become a slave. She weeps bitterly in the night with tears on her cheeks. Among all her lovers, she has none to comfort her. All her friends have dealt treacherously with her. They have become her enemies. Judah has gone into exile because of affliction and hard servitude. She dwells now among the nations, but finds no resting place. Her pursuers have all overtaken her in the midst of her distress. The roads to Zion mourn, for none come to the festival. All her gates are desolate, her priests groan. Her virgins have been afflicted, and she herself suffers bitterly. Her foes have become the head, her enemies prosper. Because the Lord has afflicted her for the multitude of her transgressions, her children have gone away captives before the foe. From the daughter of Zion, all her majesty has departed. Her princes have become like deer that find no pasture. They have fled without strength before the pursuer. Jerusalem remembers in the days of her affliction and wandering all the precious things that were hers from days of old. When her people fell into the hand of the foe, and there was none to help her, her foes gloated over her. They mocked at her downfall. Jerusalem sinned grievously, and therefore she became filthy. All who honored her despise her, for they have seen her nakedness. She herself groans and turns her face away. Her uncleanness was in her skirts. She took no thought of her future. Therefore her fall is terrible. She has no comforter. O Lord, behold my affliction, for the enemy has triumphed. The enemy has stretched out his hands over all her precious things, for she has seen the nations enter her sanctuary, those whom you forbade to enter your congregation. All her people groan as they search for bread. They trade their treasures for food to revive their strength. Oh, look, O Lord, and see, for I am despised. So there's our first segment, a look at the sea, and as you notice, the writer is comparing it to a woman. I'm not sure why he chose to do that, because it probably carried the impact that he wanted it to have. And I thought, how normal for a guy, you name your car after a woman, you name your, right? That's just what guys do. So maybe it's that, but I think it's more than that. And he wants to show, in that culture especially, the helplessness and hopelessness that the city is feeling and experiencing. So we began last time with the widow seated. So you see this lonely, seated person like a widow. And interestingly enough, I think we talked last time about, in case I need it, about how that picture of a seated woman is even used many years later in 70 AD, and I found some pictures for you. So here it is, when Titus destroyed Rome in 70 AD. In 71 AD, his father, the emperor,
You want the coin?
there, had a couple of coins minted. You can do that when you were emperor. And right here it says Judea Capta. Here is the Titus victorious one, and here is Judah seating there, got her arm up to her face, and if you make that out or not, this poor woman defeated there. And then the other one they had done is, here is the victorious emperor, and here is the seated Judea Capta with a triumphal trophy that she's beneath there. And this is an imprint of Emperor Vespasian with his name, I think, somewhere around here. So there it is, Rome using the same imagery that is here in Lamentations to demonstrate a defeated nation, and that of a woman that is seated and desolate. So that was our first one. We find her in the second one, describing her, how there's just no comfort. The image of her weeping uncontrollably, the tears always on her cheeks, and even in the night when normally you would expect rest and some respite from it, it continues. No one to comfort her. Friends and lovers, those religions, those other nations that they thought were all playing nicey-nicey, as soon as she goes down, they all turn. And of course, you've never had that experience where things went against you for some reason, and those who you thought were your supporters suddenly come running in to join the enemy and to get what they can get. Well, that's exactly what's happened to the nation here. They've all turned on him. And Judah has gone into exile, to affliction and hard servitude, and dwells among the nations, which we see yet today. And I didn't have time last time. On the very last one, her pursuers have overtaken her in the midst of her distress. The Hebrew is very descriptive there. It talks about that they are in a very narrow place, or a tight place, and it has the description of Like if you were going through a mountain pass with high walls, one of the places an army would attempt to attack would be when you're all hemmed in on all sides. You got only one way of escape or two, so you really got them pinched in tight. That's this description here. And you'll often see in the Hebrew, and you'll see it in Psalms and other places where it talks, he brought me out into a wide place as a place of blessing, where you're on a wide open, lots of room, you go any way you want. That's a place of blessing. And when the Hebrew wants to tell you you're in a very, very difficult spot, it's a narrow place where you can't get out. They were very familiar with that. They are just boxed in, and it is really difficult. So those were the ones we went over last time. This time we'll be looking at the next few verses, see how far we can get. As we see the city in this desperate situation, one more little description in verse 4 that brings you a little closer. The road to Zion mourn, for none come to the festival. Her gates are desolate, her priests groan. Her virgins have been afflicted, and she herself suffers bitterly. It's starting to look back at what normally would happen in Jerusalem. Jerusalem being the center of the nation, it's the capital city, and it is something else really important. Center of worship. And so the roads into Jerusalem, especially on a festival time or a feast day, when the whole nation is called to come in, what are they going to look like? They are crowded. In fact, we saw that even at the Lord's crucifixion, and he talked about how the city was just crammed full of people. You know, there's no place to stay. Everything's crammed. The roads are full. And now they're looking at it and saying, the roads to Zion mourn. They're mourning, they're grieving. There's nobody out there. The roads are desolate. The weeds are starting to grow up between the paving stones because there's no traffic. This is the freeway now abandoned. And so the streets are empty. And then it mentions the gates. All her gates are desolate and her priests groan. What's the big deal about gates?
The city gate is where they met for, city business.
It's an important place, yeah. That's where everybody shows up. That's where commerce is going to take place around, and the main entries and things, and at the gates. And if you wanted to go to court to get something resolved between yourself and between somebody that stole your field or stole your cow, they were also, yeah, all the security's gone, the guarding is gone, the courts are gone, nobody's hanging out at the gates. The gates are desolate, just empty. No one there. In fact, they're broken down and burned. All the wooden has been torched. There's nothing left there. So those things are, they've gone. There's no one celebrating the feast there. And why are the priests in such grief, if they're even there? Why are they groaning? Well, one, the place of employment is gone. The source of sustenance for the priests is gone because the worship is no more. They didn't have any other backup job. That was their job, their employment. It's gone. And if they're real priests that are dedicated to what they're doing, it's gone. Everything we dedicated our life to service at the temple, is over. And then this interesting one, her virgins have been afflicted. What would that have to do related to the other part? Well, if you go and read about their festal practices and things, you find out that the young women with their timbrels were often part of that worship service. As they would lead in some kind of dances and music, and those young virgins were the ones that did it. And it says they have been afflicted, they are gone. They're oppressed and she herself, Zion herself, suffers bitterly, terrible. They're in bitterness. Mara is the word there that you may have seen before. It says everything that I'd hoped for in the religious life and the activities around Jerusalem is now so gone. It's hard to imagine the contrast, but they're trying to remember what happened before. Moving on to the next thing. What about all the places and the people around her? It says, in very descriptive, her foes have become the head. And it's assumed that you can put two and two together. And where does that put Judah? At the tail. But Judah was supposed to be the head. I mean, that's what God was saying. You are the most exalted one of the nation. All this is playing on things that they had learned and expected and been told that God wanted for them. He said, this is what I want for you, but if you don't listen up, you will end up someplace else. Instead of being ruling over all the nations, you're going to be ruled by them. And here it is. The enemies have become the head. Her enemies prosper. They're wealthy. Why are they wealthy? For one, yeah, they took everything that we had. So they're now wealthy, and we are without. They've got everything. And then it's almost like, and probably seems to them, and may even be true, they're prospering way beyond, they're doing well, and our business has crashed. Things here have just gone down the tank, and they're doing better. And the reason is, this is the first time it's brought out and directly mentioned. The reason for the whole thing is because the Lord has afflicted her for the multitude of her transgressions. God's the one that's done it. Wow. Said for the nation's transgressions. He didn't just allow it. It actually says he has done it. He has actually caused it. He is the one doing the doing. Yeah. Yeah, it's very direct about that. Good point. He said God has done it. And they knew that he would do it because in Deuteronomy, he told them that. And in Leviticus, he's told them that this is your end of the deal.
It wasn't just Deuteronomy, all the prophets as well.
All the prophets have been telling them that from Moses all the way through, everybody's been telling them this could happen. This is the way it's going to be headed. It's kind of an interesting challenge to them because they're being reminded. You were told. You were told. We might look at that verse here in a minute or two, but just kind of hang with the thought here as you can. You can see the progression. Here's the city alone. Here's the weeping in the morning over what's happened. The exile and servitude, no resting place. Pursuers overtaken us. The roads are empty. The city is empty. The festivals have ended. The enemies are leading. We are following. Everything is just getting worse and worse. And her children have gone away captives before the foe. Our children are gone away. What are our children? It's our hope of the future. Is gone away. In fact, the way they're driven away, captives of the foe. It's like a description of a herd of sheep or something being driven somewhere. They're herded.
Doesn't this kind of thing happen over and over and over again to Jerusalem? Or to Israel?
The nation, since this time, yeah, you've seen it's happened again. And I mean, they went out, they came back, they're gone again. And they've just been, this has been ongoing, especially the idea that they're out among the nations. I mean, yeah, they have a nation of Israel now, but they're still, as a nation, scattered around the world. They're everywhere. And they haven't yet been recalled, and they don't have their king in place. They don't have the temple in place. They don't have all that they expected to have. So yeah, it's just like a repeating thing, but especially this one was like the first big hello. They've been through several little things, but this one's the capital city falling. all their little children, and the terminology there really is for children of tender age. It's the youngest ones who have been packed up and herded out of town and been taken captive. And if you think about that, we know some of them. Ezekiel was one of them. Daniel was one of them. Probably Mordecai, the one we read about in Esther. Mordecai was probably one of them. The interesting thing in all of this, you got to keep in your mind, this inflicted the whole nation, even though some individuals were personally faithful to their God. Just like the writer of this lamentation, it's like, if it wasn't Jeremiah himself, faithfully saying it's going to happen, it's going to happen, it's going to happen, you need to listen, you need to listen. And he ended up being forcibly led out to Egypt. He didn't go to Babylon because the Babylonians said, hey, he was trying to tell you, you take care of him. And then the other folks grabbed him and hauled him off to Egypt after the fact. But all those people went through the same stuff, even those who were faithful. So is God unjust to judge the righteous with the unrighteous? What happened to the nation as a body, and he was faithful to his individual ones and where they went and how they went, just like Daniel. And so there's a whole other set of studies you can take out of this and follow those people and go, how did Daniel handle this? We read about Daniel and we lions Daniel and all, and he's just so faithful. You forget he went through this. He was grabbed up as a young man, hauled off as a slave, and then God, the story of God watching over him. So there's a number of interesting stories there. I digress. Yes?
I read something once, and I don't know how true it is, but that when we get to heaven, we will rejoice in God's justice.
As we understand what his justice really
That
is,
we still
we'll rejoice.
desire God's justice, and if these people were faithful and saw their country falling apart, you know what I mean?
And you see glimpses of that in here, even in verse 5 there, where he says, the reason this has happened, it's almost like a little commentary in the midst of, when you got the news report, here's a little commentary. Well, this has happened because somebody didn't maintain the water system, and now we have this gusher down here. And it's kind of the same way he's looking at it in that very thing, saying,
I mean, it
God's...
must be hard, watching their fellow countrymen just completely ruining their relationship with God and wanting and desiring God to show himself.
Right.
And God, you allow this? And desecrate your name like this?
Yeah.
And when he does take action, maybe they're ready for it.
Yeah, it could very well be they're saying, well, it's not easy, but this is God following through on what he said. Yes?
Isn't that called heads of the United States?
In a lot of ways it could be. I mean, we're not the promised land and all that sort of thing, but yet, who made the quote? If somebody famous made the quote, if God doesn't do something to the United States, he'll have to apologize to Sodom and Gomorrah for what he did there. And so that's kind of that same thinking, is that there are expectations God has for us as a nation, for the blessings that he's allowed us to enjoy.
It's all, it seems like in our nation right now, it's all in God's face, everything is going on, so God is.
Yeah, and some of us are saying, okay, God, show them.
Yeah, right.
But don't do it to me. Don't get me caught up in this. It's not my fight. No, but it is. So yeah, there's messages in here, I think, for us personally as well as nationally, that he hasn't changed and his standards haven't changed. So, okay, verse 6. Here. From the daughter of Zion, all her majesty has departed. Somehow that just doesn't have the oomph in it. The beauty is gone. Everything that was beautiful about the nation and about Jerusalem has vanished. It's absolutely gone. It's in ruins. The temple is burned. The people are gone. the beautiful places, the favorite places that they had. You know, it's like in your town, do you have a park you just really like? Or do you have some other place that's beautiful? It's saying those precious things are gone. The thing that made Jerusalem special is gone. It's been burned up. The description that follows that is most interesting. Her princes have become like deer that find no pasture. Who are her princes? Who are the princes of Judah? The leaders, the king. Do you remember when we were finishing up our last study in 2 Kings and 2 Chronicles, and we got a little bit of the book of Jeremiah in there? What did King Zedekiah, in his great leadership movement effort at the very end there, as the city's falling and they're coming in through the walls, he gathered up some key leaders and made a really courageous move, right? He snuck out through the back gate and made a dash for the Jordan. He and some guys. That is exactly what's in view here. It says the princes, like a bunch of starving deer, have gone. They're like deer that have had no pasture. They're weak because they haven't eaten, and they're fleeing before the pursuer without strength, and they got nailed. They didn't get very far. They were hunted. And the interesting is that it's like it's not just a deer, it's a stag. It's the one that was supposedly protecting the herd, and that there's really an effort here to show those who were supposed to be the ones looking out for everybody else are looking out for themselves. They just said, abandon the city, abandon the people, save every man for himself. Let's get out of here. And even at that, they were a miserable failure. And the pursuer there, if I've got my notes correct here, the Hebrew word for pursuer is a unique way in the way they spelled it. It says they used all of the letters in the word here, and it's unique in the whole Bible. They don't use this word this way anywhere else. And it means full pursuit. When they found out he was gone, they didn't just send out a couple of guys to go get him. They were pressing him hard. They wanted him, and they wanted him now. So when they heard there was somebody making a break for it, they just turned all the dogs loose and ran them to ground. And so it's a picture of panic, starvation, exhaustion, leadership just evaporating. So now we've got that snapshot of what happened to the leadership in the city. It just crumbled when the pressure came on.
Do you know what a hart, H-A-R-T, is?
Yeah, that's the stag, if you will, the
okay.
deer. Yeah, it's one of the translations of that word is the male deer. The one that's supposed to be so powerful and beautiful and graceful is now running with his tongue hanging out, barely able to keep going. And then, if that wasn't bad enough, we got verse 7. Jerusalem remembers in the days of her affliction and wandering all the precious things that were hers from days of old.
Good old days.
The good old days. Isn't it funny with us, the things that we remember that we never even thought about, just took for granted when you don't have them anymore? A really minor example is that everybody that's ever been on a go team in the Philippines with me comes back into the United States, goes to the airport, sticks their hand in, and goes, hot water. Oh, wow. It's just so different. We didn't know we were going to miss that. Simple little things. But here it says they remember all those things were there from days of old. Well, what did they have from days of old that they might remember? Oh my gosh. Moses and the prophets, all that stuff, the promises that were made to the nation, says we were supposed to be the apple of God's eye, and here we are. So it's the promises. It's also, yes, it's the physical things, the precious things of the temple, all packed off to Babylon. They're gone. All those things that were in the palace that the king had are gone. The gold that was applied to the doors of the temple are gone, stripped off, burned away. So all that stuff. And it all happened when they fell into the hands of the foe. There's nobody there. The adversary overcomes, and their foes gloated over her, and they mocked at her downfall. They're looking at her and saying, "You thought your God was so good." This is really what the point is. It's not just over them. If the adversary says, "Our God has beaten your God," that's what the mocking is all about, as they remember these things. There is nobody to help her, and they think they have won. They have defeated her. And they're rubbing it in. Where is your God, O Israel? We're almost out of time. Oh, good. We won't have to do this too much longer. Boy, it just goes on and on, doesn't it? I mean, it just can grind you down as you listen to this, what has happened to them. And you go, boy, why would they read this over and over again every year? In the sanctuary, or in the, what's the word I want for the Jewish place of worship? The synagogues read this every year, about July, August time frame. The 9th of Av, they read this again. In verse 8, here it is again, a little commentary on the side. Jerusalem sinned grievously, therefore she became filthy. Boy, that doesn't have the impact that it needs to have. She sinned grievously, and the result is that she became separated, untouchable. The word there, she's become unclean, and there's a reason it's used of this woman who has become unclean, because the scripture, when you go back, there's things about cleanness and uncleanness, and there's one thing that makes a woman unclean and untouchable, and that is her monthly period. And that's what this is talking about. So this is just like a woman who's going through that time in her month when she is considered unclean. And it all goes back to the description. Boy, I spent quite a while reading about that, trying to sort out why is that. It seems so unfair that something you can't control makes you unclean. It sounds very much like original sin, the sin nature that we inherit from Adam. There's nothing we can do to change that. It's just there, it's part of us, and it makes us unacceptable to God. And this is a picture of that. That's what makes us unclean. But they use that here in this image of a woman to say she has become filthy, and the word there is a technical term referring to her being unclean. And because of that, she is despised, she is shunned. They don't honor her anymore. And they have seen her nakedness. In other words, she has been exposed. Her sin has been exposed. She has been exposed to the world. There's no more hiding under a fancy garment or fancy dresses. Everybody's seen it. Even she is turning away in shame from anyone who will look upon her. And I think it's descriptive probably not only of what they're trying to illustrate here, this untouchable woman, but they're illustrating what would happen to prisoners. Women who are prisoners and in slavery would be stripped of their fancy clothes, and they would be led off, often naked. It would also be done to, she's been compared to being a harlot, those who ran off with her, and that was one of the punishments for that as well, was to be stripped of your fancy clothes. So there are really word pictures here, really trying to show her uncleanness, her sin has caused her to be embarrassed, revealed, and shunned for her sin. a shame we're out of time and have to stop right there, because the next one follows that she should have seen it coming. Let's just read it quick and then we'll close. Her uncleanness was in her skirts, but she took no thought to her future. It said, and again, it's talking about if she's having her menstrual flow and the blood is on her skirts, it's visible to those around, and she's pretending like it's not there. Saying that is, it was visible, you could see it, and the fringes of her, you could see it in her clothes if you just look. And she took no thought to her future. And therefore her fall, in some of your translations will say, you're wonderful. And you're going, huh? No. It means it was unbelievable, catastrophic, terrible.
That means that she didn't have means or an opportunity to care for herself and all those things.
Didn't care for herself, didn't see the problem, didn't see the issue, and it was all that more catastrophic because they never saw it coming. Should have, but didn't. We'll pick it up there next time and expand on that a little bit. Sorry to leave you with such depressing, gloomy situation, but trust me, as we go through this, you'll begin to see it turn from the devastation that God has leveled on the city to understanding why, and the confession and the hope that's still there as we trust that that God who made that promise, who said it will never go away, the promise is going to be there. You're enjoying it is dependent on your being faithful, and that's true of our salvation. Can never go away, can't be taken from us. But our enjoyment of that salvation, sometimes God says, I have to chasten all those that I love. And He will do that, and sometimes He does it somewhat tenaciously. So, anyway, let's close. Father, we thank You for our time together this morning, for working our way through this challenging piece of Scripture that describes the city being so devastated, the nation and the people, and the things that caused them such devastation. Help us, Father, to take some instruction from that for our own lives and for our own nation, to remain faithful to You even in difficult times, to be able to trust You even in difficult times, that You are sometimes not disciplining. Not all of those that were in this, were exported, were done because of discipline. Some were doing that so that You might be glorified in them as they went through this difficult time. And so while it may have come about as a judgment of a nation as a whole, there were individuals within that who were able to demonstrate Your grace, Your continuing love and faithfulness to them as they trusted You, and You saw them through a very, very hard time. Father, may we be like them, that recognize that discipline has to come, that changes, hard times are part of life sometimes that we are part of as You cause these things to happen, and yet we can have our eyes upon You. We can have an opportunity to glorify You as the one who is faithful. Help us to do that in faith and even with joy. We thank You, Father, in Jesus' name.